Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
Today I want to share some reflections on speaking at the Gain Systems event in Chicago. And the topic of the presentation was on 5 reasons we've not made progress on inventory. In the room were 120 business leaders, and I asked them to think hard about what were their issues in reducing inventory. And we started with some research that I had done where we had contrasted inventory levels by industry, pre-recession and post-recession. And what we see is that while household products and personal products have made progress, all other industries have gone backwards. And the degree into which they've gone backwards is actually surprising to most supply chain leaders because people feel that since they've spent 1.7% of revenue on supply chain systems that we've made a lot of progress. And then they're surprised to find out that we've not. So as I looked in the faces of the people in the room, I looked for people to react or respond to the 5 reasons that I gave. The first reason was we're not good at the selection of supply chain planning systems. And in fact, the success of a selection of supply chain planning system is about the same as the flip of a coin at Las Vegas. 50% of business users are satisfied. However, if we ask IT professionals about inventory and technologies for inventory, 70% of companies are satisfied with their inventory systems at the IT level. So how can we have this disconnect? Well, it's pretty easy. The IT organization is focused on implementing, getting things up and running, whereas the business leader is more focused on, does the technology work? And when we look at system selection, we find gaps in the depth of the engines, what-if analysis, scalability, user interface, will people use this solution? And so as we look at the current selection, more people are focused on IT standardization and integration with the false belief that if I buy from the same vendor, in other words, if it has, an Infor label across it or an SAP label across it, that it'll be integrated. And nothing could be further from the truth because we find that often integration doesn't happen just because solutions have the same name. It requires really process integration and workflow. So many companies have bought based upon integration when really what we need to do is focus on engines, usage, and scalability. The other thing is 68% of companies are very dependent on Excel spreadsheets. In fact, we operate Excel ghettos around the world where people work in maverick spreadsheets and they don't really have connection from one desk to the other. And I often go to a meeting where I'll watch the discussion of, and what do you have as the macro in that cell? And, let's look at your spreadsheet compared to my spreadsheet. So we don't have a common view. The third thing is that holistic thinking about inventory is a struggle for many because we focused on safety stock in DRP or MRP logic, but we've not really looked at the design of systems or the ability to look at postponement, platform rationalization, push-pull decoupling points, and the design of inventory strategies for lumpy and hard to forecast demand. Another barrier has been the complexity and the growing of the long tail. And there's a belief that if I just improve forecasting, that inventory will get better. Well, it's really not true. And we've got to have the right inventory strategies for the type of demand. And I think about demand as a river that flows through the supply chain. And in this river, we've got to really get at the boulders. And the boulders can be dirty data, it can be products that aren't forecasted, it could be manual manipulation, it could be perhaps a time sequence issue. But as we plot the river of demand from the customer's customers to the supplier's supplier, we've got to look at the boulders that are causing us to have issues with demand translation and embrace inventory as the most important buffer or shock absorber in the supply chain. When I was running manufacturing, we had two primary buffers. One was inventory and the second was capacity, excess capacity. But many clients that I work with have really loaded up those assets. So inventory is the primary buffer. So we've got to think about buffer strategies and shock absorbers, and not just cycle stock, but form and function of inventory. Where should we hold inventory? Should it be a raw material, a semi-finished good, a finished good, or should it be at the customer site? And the location of the inventory needs to be driven by segmentation. And I'm not talking about just ABC classification, but I'm looking at volume and demand patterns. So I recommend that people plot volume, so item volume, and on the x-axis also plot by demand error. So things that are really hard to forecast, even though they may have high volume, need an inventory strategy that embraces them, and perhaps we hold them as raw materials or postponement strategies. And so we need to match inventory strategies with this segmentation, not just by volume, but also by demand flow in this river of demand, so that we can have the flexibility and the shock absorbers for that river. Now, the last is probably difficult for many of the people in the room, because the people in the room were more junior, but it's about alignment. It's about understanding what is inventory. I work with one company that always manipulates inventory at the end of the quarter. It's sort of like their piggy bank. They're going to make numbers. They're going to improve cash to cash. And so they're always manipulating numbers. And so at this company, the cycle goes like this. We cut the heck out of inventory at the end of the quarter. We have to rebuild it beginning the next quarter. We spend 6 to 8 weeks apologizing to customers for missed cases. Then we build to the right levels, and then there we go. Inventory's cut again. So one of the things that I've worked with this company on is to present to the executive team a simulation about form and function of inventory and how cutting inventory at the end of the quarter actually hurts them in customer service. It's one thing to say it, but if I just say it, people think that I'm whining as a supply chain professional, right? If I can show it in simulation, most people have a better understanding of it. So as we think about alignment, the other issue is alignment between commercial teams and supply chain teams. Now, the commercial teams will often think that, if I have lots of inventory, then I'm going to have great customer service. And that's not true either. And one of my favorite podcasts was with Daniel Weber of Beiersdorf, and he talks about how Beiersdorf is a private company, makes wonderful, lotions and creams for women like myself that, don't want our skin to age. And his commercial team really wanted him to have a lot of inventory. But the problem with having a lot of inventory is I fill those warehouses, I can't get to it, and often the products will go out of date or they won't be effective. So having excess inventory is really not the right strategy. Often with finance wants to have very lean inventories to improve cash to cash. And there's always a balance between inventory cost and customer service. And so right-sizing the inventory can be difficult with finance, particularly if the organization has gone through a lot of item additions and we're dealing with a long tail, and people don't realize that with high demand volatility in the long tail, we need a greater proportion of inventory. And so that requires education with finance. So alignment, Excel spreadsheets, holistic thinking, selection of planning systems, and being able to design the supply chain for inventory. These are the 5 reasons I gave. Now, as I looked at the audience, the 2 that resonated were dirty data and this concept called planning master data. And we talked quite a while about this. Planning master data is something that I think people don't really conceive. And, when we put in planning systems, we put in lead times or cycle times, and we put those in as a fixed number, and most companies have the same numbers in their systems as when they implement it. But what we find is that planning lead times, replenishment lead times, yield data, cycle data is actually not a constant but a variable. And it changes. It changes year over year. And so what people who are very mature at planning do is they have a planning master data reference base that allows them to look at what are the lead times coming out of the Port of LA, in November, which are higher than April, and what does it take to get through Chicago in a snowstorm. And so changing those planning lead times and making sure we're current is an important piece. That gets at dirty data. And also making sure that we understand things like substitution logic and new product launch items. I'm always amazed at how many companies reuse item numbers over and over again, which causes an issue in item integrity. So dirty data resonated. And then there was a lot of defensive pushback on Excel spreadsheets. I believe that we can't really use Excel spreadsheets to model complex nonlinear system. And there was a lot of pushback. People like spreadsheets. They like working in Maverick kind of isolated work. And we talked through it, and my whole pushback was, why are companies using Excel spreadsheets? We got to get to the why. Is it because the employees didn't like the user interface? Is it because the modeling is insufficient in the current tool? We've got to get to the why, but we can't have desperate, isolated conditions, and we can't have the inability to do effective modeling. So those were my 5 reasons, and those were the responses. So if you're listening to this, my recommendation is for you to look at slow and obsolete inventory, because it is usually a way that you can see where your issues are. If you look at slow and obsolete inventory, you can see where you may have issues with alignment or dirty data. The other data to look at are shorts, items that are shorted, and to look for root cause. When you compare the root cause issues of obsolete and slow moving against customer fill rates, you can quickly see where you need to focus. This is Lora Cecere. Until next time.